it's an amazing thing, actually, to sort of.
Well, good morning. It's Westdoc Online again. I'm Chuck Braverman. I'm your moderator. We have a fabulous show for you today. It's all about Imax. If you're watching this live now on Twitter or Facebook or Periscope or YouTube or on our website, and if you have any questions for our panel, it would be great if you could go to Twitter and use hashtag Westdoc Online. And if you have any questions, put them on Westdoc Online. Or you could send me an email. So we haven't been real successful with the questions because I haven't really been monitoring it because I'm doing about 12 things here. And but we're going to try this time to take questions at Westdoc Online. And I can see we're actually live because I'm watching it now on Twitter, which is kind of interesting. It's 9:30 in the morning on the West Coast. It's 12:30 on the East Coast. It's 1:30 in Bermuda, where one of our guests is coming to us live. So let me think before I introduce the guests. Do I have anything else? 2 weeks from today, we're going to have a new show all about programming on National Geographic with the Vice President of Development, Charlie Parsons. So be sure to tune in for that. And let's meet our guests today. Hello, in the upper left-hand corner is Greg McGilvery from McGilvery Freeman Films, coming to us from Laguna Beach. Is that right, Greg?
Yeah, that's right.
And in the upper right-hand corner is my friend, my old friend, Stephen Lowe, who happens to be on location today in Bermuda.
That's correct.
And you're in where? A hotel room right now? You're not on a ship?
Yes, sir.
Bobbing up and down. And the lower
No, the
left-hand
ship's
corner is director of photography, Sean Phillips in the Los Angeles. Hi, Sean. Happened to be also a USC Trojan, as I am. You never get rid of that. Hi, where are you in Los Angeles? What part of LA are you in?
Santa Monica.
Oh, good. Well, I know that town. And also in that neck of the woods is my longtime friend, Mark Krenzian, who's a producer, director, writer. How are you doing, Mark?
Excellent, from Marina Del Rey.
Good. So today we want to talk about IMAX. And, you know, I sort of had the epiphany that, you know, unless you have little children and you take them to the museum, or unless you're older and you remember really going to a real IMAX film, a lot of people think of IMAX as the latest Avengers movie or Batman movie, and they don't really realize what IMAX is. Why don't we start with Greg? And how did you get into IMAX? And you want to give us just an idea of really what IMAX is, please, Greg?
Sure. Well, I got involved in the early 70s, and IMAX was first invented right around 1968, and it was in a World's Fair in Japan. That was its first exhibition. Some Graham Ferguson, Bill Shaw, Bob Kerr, and Roman Kreuter got together. They're filmmakers, and they got together and they designed this new system that could project a huge image onto a gigantic screen. So they figured the bigger the film negative, the sharper the image on that giant screen, and the more light that you can get through that single frame to project onto the big screen. And so it will be more real. And they had done multiple films for other World's Fairs with multiple projectors, 6 projectors, 9 projectors. And it was problematic because a projector would break down. And so they formed this company called Multiscreen Limited and built this one projector that could hold 9 35 millimeter images in one frame. So the film frame is 9 to 10 times as big as 35 millimeter. Now, when we first saw it in right around 1973, it was one of those sensational experiences where you end up thinking that you've seen the best thing you've ever seen technically in your life. It was kind of the same experience that I saw, or I felt when I saw 2001 in 1968, where you just think you're seeing something that is so stunning that it isn't real, that it's just real life, and it transports you into the screen. And then Jim and I were invited by the Air and Space Museum because we had done a lot of films about flying, Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Skyriders and a few others. And they decided that they wanted to put in an IMAX theater for their opening in 1976. In 1974, they chose our company to make this film. We titled it To Fly, and we essentially gave the audience in our bicentennial year here in Washington, D.C., the sense of flying, the feeling of flight in a 26-minute film. And that film, which was about the 6th or 7th film done in this format, kind of took the world by storm. It was so kind of transporting, I guess, that people wrote about it. And because you're in a center of culture and art in Washington and the center of our country, where a lot of diplomats from around the world come, you ended up having the perfect venue for selling the IMAX format to every museum in the world. And after a year of showing To Fly there, with 1.5 million attendance, every museum wanted that profit center. They wanted that place that their guests at every museum could come in and rest, and then be transported to someplace else in the world and have a new experience that they couldn't offer in the hallways of their museum. So it became a gigantic success after that, and the IMAX Corporation, they changed their name to IMAX, and then they started selling projectors around the world. Now, it was slow going up until about 1980, 85. The rollout of projectors and systems, because each one of those beautiful screens, projectors, and theaters costs, between $3 to $5 million to build. Not a lot of museums could find that kind of funding. But what we did in Laguna is we started our business based on that model, that more of these places would come. Jim and I loved making To Fly, and though Jim died in 1976, right before the premiere of the film, I kind of dedicated my company, which I now had to run on my own, to trying to produce these educational documentaries that really, truly made a difference with the audience, where they really did get an experience that was exceptional.
You wanted to show us
And,
that piece of film that you have, please?
Oh, yeah.
70 mil?
This is something that we just shot last week. It's an aerial in Santa Monica, the pier. And you can see the frames. Each one of those frames is 10 times bigger than 35 millimeter. And you use standard Kodak 200 ASA stock, and you get a tremendous number of equivalent pixels in each one of these frames. Now, people like David Keeley, who is one of the gurus of IMAX technically, estimates, as does Kodak, that there's probably the equivalent of about 150 million pixels per frame. If you were to count the grains and look at the color range and all that. And that's why I think we all love shooting this kind of film.
So, not to one-up you or anything, Greg, but just to age myself, I went to the New York World's Fair in '65 and was really excited about some multiple screen stuff that I saw there. And so then the summer of '67, I spent most of the summer in Montreal at a little event called Expo '67.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that one of the hit films of Expo '67, which was before IMAX, was something called To Be Alive, which was 3-screen. And there was interactive films from the Czech Republic, and it was just fantastic. And then I went to Osaka '70, just FYI, and saw the IMAX films there. Let's go over to Stephen for a second, who I think his history goes back, just as far, if not farther, because your father was one of the pioneer, filmmakers at the National Film Board of Canada, where all this was really gelling. Can you want to tell us a little bit about your background and history and involvement in IMAX, please?
Well, my dad made Labyrinth at Expo '67, which was a big hit. And he worked on the first IMAX film for the Fuji Pavilion at Expo '70 in Japan. I came to IMAX after working on Hollywood films for a while. I made a film for one of the partners, Roman Kreuter, at the film board that was very successful. So I got a chance to do a Japanese World's Fair film called Skyward, and I think it was released in '85, and it was popular. So onward and upward from there.
Well, you didn't say about your best experience working with me at Sony.
Oh yeah. Well, that's influenced somewhat by the huge 3D camera we had to use, which was a real work with it. There it is.
There it is. Let me see if
I think it's 300 pounds of 20-minute reloads, and trying to do drama for the first time was a real challenge.
There's that camera. I cut your audio off, and that's why I cut that picture back. And that's the new mini cam, I think, for IMAX 3D, right? I don't know. That brings back memory. That's amazing, isn't it? How can you make a film with that? I mean, if you look back at the pictures from the early 30s, when they first went to sound, and they had these large blimps over them. I mean, this is even more extreme. And I seem to recall when we were working on Across the Sea of Time, the running gag was, when you flipped on the switch for the camera, by the time it got up to speed, you were like up to $250 worth of film and processing before you shot a frame, right?
Yeah, that's why I never did slates, which annoyed the editors to no end.
Why don't we take a look at, if I can click on this and see what you're working on now. Here's a trailer for it's a little different film. So let's take a look at this.
Look at this. This is the 405. Look at this traffic jam.
Speeds on it. That traffic barely moving at 5 miles of cars getting nowhere fast.
So I take it you're obsessed with trains. Is that the fact, Steve?
Yeah, he is.
I've looked at your
Yeah,
your
that's
credit
the-
list, and it's like every third film has something to do with trains somewhere, right?
That's true. Yeah, I thought this was an important film to make because very few documentaries in IMAX really tackle any of the solutions to global warming. It's fine to love, polar bears and panda bears and teddy bears and everything, but we really need to have solutions. And I thought the trolley was a wonderful story because it had emerged out of the 19th century as a solution to horse manure that was filling up all the cities, and it was a very effective, even in the early days, and incredibly energy efficient. I think that the first trolley in Richmond, Virginia, first good one, was in Richmond, Virginia, and the cars used about a quarter of a horsepower per person. And if you can provide zero emission electricity, you could take a huge chunk out of our problem of CO2 emissions, and improve your cities, improve your lifestyle, lose weight. There's a million other advantages
Lose weight?
to a good public transit. Oh yeah, public transit. You have to do a lot of walking or bicycling. You'll have a lot more space for that.
I was just in Toronto for Hot Docs, where I think did your film? It didn't premiere there. Was it just showing at the festival? Is that right?
No, it premiered there.
It premiered.
We had
ironically, right on the street, I think where it premiered is where the Toronto trolley, was it on Queens Road or Kings Road, where they have that fabulous trolley which goes down there. And I don't know if you guys know this or if you've addressed this in any of your 27 train films, but LA used to have an enormous electric trolley system which went all over the city, and I don't know what it cost, a nickel or a dime or whatever it was. And then there was a documentary made several years ago, I think, that where General Motors somehow, it seemed at the time, was involved perhaps in trying to push out the trolley to promote cars, and LA became such a car town, and now we're trying to go back in the other direction if we can.
Well, the thing to remember about that is that it's not just the car companies, oil and tire companies. It's the public and the government who loves fuel taxes and all the taxes associated with buying and running and maintaining cars. So, the more energy you waste, the more damage you cause the environment, the better it is for the government. That's why you look everywhere in the world, you look down at, even Tahiti, and it's gridlock everywhere. Well, governments don't really care if you get to work or not. They just want the taxes. And the more fuel you burn, the better.
Sean Phillips is a DP, and on your credits, there seems to be a lot of work that you've done with CGI also, and you've shot a bunch of IMAX films. And one of the things that I learned when I was an executive at Sony was that the language of film, the way you shoot, is different. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background in IMAX and about the language of film as far as you're concerned from a DP's point of view?
Sure. Yeah, it is very different from shooting a regular film, because right off the bat, when you're making an IMAX film, particularly the IMAX documentaries for the institutional market, half of your revenue is going to come from the dome theaters, which are huge curved screens, very unique immersive experience, and the other half are going to come from the 3D theaters. So you have to make sure you frame the film for both of those formats, and the dome is the most restrictive of the two. So you actually have to make sure your film will work in a dome. And the kind of short way of saying that is you have to completely change your notion of where eye lines are and where the center of interest is compared to a regular film. Like ordinary framing is very basic. You usually put the highs very high in the frame. In the IMAX format, a good rule of thumb is you really don't ever want to have anybody's eyes above the center of frame. Now, if you were to frame a traditional movie that way, that would be very strange. You'd say, what the heck? How come there's so much headroom? But you need that headroom for it to look normal in the dome theaters and in the 3D theaters as well. So a lot of filmmakers, it takes quite a bit of getting used to. You also have to get used to the fact that when you're shooting what looks like a medium shot, that's actually a close-up. It's also very difficult to do two shots. Like a two shot might look good in an IMAX theater, but it may not look very good in the dome because you're going to have one person way off to the left and the other person way off to the right. So you have to completely rethink how you do things. And it takes a lot of experience to have seen things in enough of the venues to get a handle on what really looks good in the format.
So have you worked with directors, with some directors that was their first IMAX film, and where you might be struggling with framing and the language of film, or of all the directors that you've worked with as a DP, know what you're talking about? Because I remember when we worked with Jean-Jacques Hano at Sony, and he was a regular. This was his first IMAX film. We talked for many weeks beforehand, and even then I think it took him a while to figure it out, which he did, of course. But
yeah, I worked with Jean-Jacques as well, and he was a lot of fun to work with. But for any director who hasn't done it before, it is a learning curve. Obviously, when in the past and not so distant past, working with Stephen and Greg, and obviously they understood from the ground up just how you're supposed to do things. So in their case, there's no learning curve at all. But every other director, it's a big learning curve, especially knowing that you've got to frame it for the dome, you've got to make it work in 3D. 3D is an intimate, immersive experience, whereas a dome or a dome is more of a vast kind of landscape experience. They're very different. You have to kind of thread the needle and make it work for both those different formats, or variations on the same format, maybe I should call it.
is there a debate in the IMAX world still going on about 3D versus 2D or not?
Well,
Did I just hit the wrong button on the computer? Did I just blow up the show? I don't know.
the truth is, I think everybody probably has their favorite. Like, maybe they're happier watching their films in a dome, or maybe they're happier watching it in 3D. For me, it's really a challenge to do both. That's kind of what makes it fun. I like the fact that 3D is immersive in an intimate, kind of palpable kind of a way. And I love the fact that a dome is just this vast theater that's completely unique, where your periphery is covered by it. So I really like the challenge. I like being able to do both, because it is very difficult, and that's what makes it fun. But having said that, I'd say one of the big problems with our format today is that people often don't do either of the sub-formats very well. They kind of hit somewhere in between, or they repurpose a film that wasn't shot for the format, or they don't understand how to use 3D in an immersive way, and they just go with conversions. And conversions, by the way, there's nothing wrong with them, but to do them right is very expensive, and they usually don't have the money to do it right. So there's a lot of native stereo filming that people don't do anymore when they really should, because that's what gives you the truly immersive experience.
Let's take a look at the clip from Journey to Space and see how this relates to what we've been talking about, if at all.
We are the species that explores. We built machines to explore farther, higher. Heroes flew them beyond what seemed possible, and it wasn't enough.
We're completing a chapter of a journey that will never end. Let's light this fire one more time.
I don't know if I'll ever get to walk on Mars, but I may already know some of those who will.
So, Mark, were you the writer and director?
I was the writer-director of that and worked with Sean. And that film represents a lot of IMAX, or let's say giant screen filmmaking in the broader sense of history, in the sense that it incorporated three main things. That is, historical IMAX footage shot over the years of from space. That is somewhat in the public domain because we, the taxpayers, paid for it. Original scripting from me that Sean and I shot together, live action, and then of course the CGI creation of what the first human version of mission to Mars would look like. And I think the main purpose of that film was simply to show people that we are much closer to going to Mars. We have the technology now. It's more a matter of political and fiscal will. So that was the goal, to show the really that we're on the edge of that discovery. And I think just to come back to the big picture of IMAX, it is important to we in the field refer to it a lot now as giant screen filmmaking, because IMAX builds a lot of the projection systems, one could argue even the best of the current laser projection. But there are many ways these films are projected. And although we still love and honor the 1570, the giant film formatting, that creates this excellent picture, the reality of the industry is that more and more, as digital cameras get better and better, we're faced with these multiple tools to decide which is the best tool for a given shot. And although there is some shots at the moment, still there is no substitute for that giant 1570, especially the vistas and aerials that need to be shot by a piloted helicopter. But I think it's also worth a discussion about how this new technology is influencing the marketplace and what it means for the future of giant screen IMAX filmmaking. It strikes me that we've all talked about how these cameras that hold at best 3 minutes of film and are as loud as a lawnmower are not conducive to an intimate scene. And yet we've managed to make these lovely, brilliant, eye-opening films over the years, as evidenced by Stephen and Greg's work in particular. And yet we have these instances in a film that Sean and I worked on with Stephen called Aircraft Carrier. There's one sequence in which there's a shot taken by a GoPro camera inside the canopy of an F-18 fighter jet as it's closing, and it's just as sharp as the following shot taken by a 1570 space cam aerial shot. Why is that? Well, it was maybe good luck. The camera was mistakenly set at 2K, but because of the environment, the way the canopy was closing, the way that lens was focused, Sean could tell you as much or more about this, the aspects of that little camera were so optimized that it matched very nicely with the next shot. And so it raises the question of how do we use these new tools to perhaps make these IMAX films as intimate as they can be? When do we decide to use a new tool? I know Greg is experimenting these grand vistas and aerials that are so important to us. When does that transition into a drone shot that maybe can be closer and more intimate? And then the other thing I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on, just to get it out there, is frame rates. You could argue in most situations, IMAX institutional giant screen documentaries cannot look too real. They can't look too good. And I don't mean soap opera, chintzy TV. I mean sharp and you are there. And so one of the ways we can get more reality is with shooting at higher frame rates and exhibiting at higher frame rates. The IMAX screen is so big, so tall, 8 stories, that let's say you're panning with a car crossing the screen. It geometrically travels so far between each frame at 24 frames a second that we often have to say, can you slow that car down to 6 miles an hour so it doesn't strobe in the shot? Whereas if we were shooting at a higher frame rate and projecting at a higher frame rate, so there is even a future of IMAX that we can make it even better than it is now. So I'd be interested in people talking about that. And also, one of the advantages to the digital finishing, which no matter what we capture our films on now, they still all go through a DI process. And that allows us to tweak these films and optimize them for given venues, even though, as Sean points out, you have to have in mind all these venues when you're shooting your film. There still are individual theaters that we now in the post process can say, well, if we adjust the frame this way, it works better in that theater. So these are all tools that are expanding our ability. And I'd be interested in my fellow filmmakers' thoughts about how the digital and film interface will continue.
Well, I would definitely agree strongly with Mark that I think the future for giant screen experiences is higher frame rates, like 120 frames a second. I think that, and I think that frankly, that's going to be true for dramatic films as well. And, a few years ago, I would have thought that that was a heretical thing to say. But I think the world is really changing, and I think I've come to the conclusion that 24 frames per second is kind of a cultural acclimation. And a good example is I think kids see the difference, but they don't seem to really, they don't lose a sense of disbelief by watching things at high frame rates. I also think that the world is heading into a realm where the reality of motion pictures, virtual experiences, is as valid as our everyday reality. And on some levels, that's a very scary thing, but on others, it's kind of transcendental. It means that we're really moving into an equivalence between narrative and ideas that drive our lives as opposed to the physical reality of the world. And I think higher frame rates really manifest the reality of that virtual world. And I think that guarantees that the future all belongs to high frame rates.
So I remember going to see the Doug Trumbull demo. How many years ago was it when he did the, was it 7 years
Show
ago?
scan.
Yes, show scan. Sure. And the guy came out before the demo and was talking, and then we realized that was the demo. And the guy who looked so real was actually in the film. And do you remember, Greg? He pushed the screen forward, or something like that, and it was like shocking.
Like 3D. Actually,
it was shocking. It was shocking. So my question really is, you know, the fight that we have on television all the time, and is you want to make the video look like film, and that's why they're shooting at 24 frames a second. So you have this, you know, persistence of vision that makes it look like film. And I think IMAX movies on a big screen look spectacular and wonderful, and yet they have that essence to them that's filmic. If you make it 60 frames a second, is that going to make it more video, live, better, worse looking, or what? Anybody?
Well, I agree with Sean.
The only example,
just cultural. Go ahead.
The only example of that was a film my father made at 48 frames a second.
Momentum.
And it kind of had, if the shots were static, they looked very similar to 24 frames a second. But as soon as you move the camera, it took on a kind of video quality, which had kind of mixed reviews. Also, imagine having a minute and a half going through 1,000 feet of film every minute and a half, and twice as loud as the current 24 frames a second.
What was that film?
The other thing
what was that film, Stephen?
I forget the name of it. Maybe
it's called Momentum.
Memento?
Momentum, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
The other thing,
I think that's the problem. You know, Peter Jackson did one of the episodes of Lord of the Rings at I think it was 60 frames per second, like show scan was, and the reaction wasn't good, or maybe it was 48 frames a second. But when people watched it, they just got a sense that didn't feel real. It didn't feel good. In the studio, actually, was so disappointed in it that they only played it in that way a couple of times, and they never advertised it to try to actually appeal to the public with something new that they were proud of. It's a very strange thing, and I think, Sean, you kind of touched on it. We have this culture of understanding that reality is at 24 frames a second, and it's in our DNA, and it's going to require kids to really change us. Yeah, we have a little.
Not me.
I don't know where that's coming from.
Not me.
But you know, I'm hoping that there'll be a solution to this, so that we can actually shoot digitally at 60 frames or whatever we want, and then project that way, because it's beautiful. It's just a different kind of language of film that you have to get used to as a filmmaker, and understand what your audience is going through at the same time.
What was the film, the theatrical film made just about a year or two ago?
Billy Budd's Long Halftime.
Yeah, I went and saw that at 60 frames at the ArcLight, and the director's name I'm blanking on.
It's Ang Lee.
Ang Lee, who's one of the great, fabulous Hollywood director who's made some great films. This was not one of them, and the 60 frames a second, which I saw did not work at all. It didn't. In this film, in this particular film, I don't know whether, like Greg is saying, maybe we can make it work and it'll be beautiful. Boy, it was a distraction. It was video looking like, and beside the fact that the film,
Chuck, I mean, what I find interesting about that is first impression, like when you first see a movie like that, I feel the same way. And what happened to me, which was kind of an eye-opener, is we remodeled our kitchen a couple of years ago, and we put in a 4K TV, and it would upscale everything to 4K. And the first thing I did is I turned off the high frame rate. I went into the menu and turned it off. And okay, everything was fine. And then a little bit of time went by, the kids got a hold of it, and they upgraded the software on the TV. And that upgrade prevented me from getting rid of that effect of the high frame rate. So everything was in high frame rate, and it was kind of like, and I couldn't get rid of it now. It was like 1984 time. And what I found, surprisingly, is I actually got used to it. And if I were to watch a movie at 24, and by the way, even a movie nowadays that you see at 24 in digital, it's not 24 anymore like it was when we were kids. There's no blanking time. There's zero blanking. So you see it increment 24 times a second, but in the old days, there was a tremendous amount of flicker to it. And if you were to look at that now, you'd be shocked and you'd be kind of sickened by it, to be frankly.
So are you saying there's no persistence?
What it used to be.
There's no persistence of vision anymore in a regular theatrical movie?
Well, less of it is needed,
Because that, to me, is the secret sauce.
Yeah.
of what makes a theatrical film look like a theatrical film. And I think we're programmed to accept a certain fantasy that works at 24 frames per second. And as soon as you get to, let's just say for the sake of argument, 30 frames a second, which isn't that much different, that secret sauce becomes video, and you don't accept the fantasy which is happening in that film. Now, if you're telling me, and I was not aware of this because everything is digital now in the theaters, are you saying there's no persistence of vision at 24 frames a second in the films that we're watching?
No, there still
is,
because your brain is interpolating between steps of motion. But what it's not seeing is it's not seeing any blanking times. In other words, with a film projector, what it had was a 2 or a 3-bladed shutter that would come in there for every frame and interrupt the image. It created a flicker. And then it had these ratcheting movements that would quickly advance the
and your
frame.
Brain would fill in the black space in between the two frames.
Correct. Yep. But if you go from watching a digital 24 frames per second movie now and watch a film projection with a 2 or 3-bladed shutter, you'll be surprised how much flickering there is. And interestingly, with 30 frames a second as opposed to 24, you're right if everything is kept equal. But back in the 50s, when they actually double shot films like Oklahoma at 24 and 30, you sat a lot closer to the screen when it was run at 30, and it actually ended up feeling about the same. Like 24 in a smaller screen felt about like 30 on a bigger screen that was filling more of your.
Why were they double shooting? Why were they double shooting?
Because they had to release it in the regular theaters as well that existed, as well as the big kind of showcase theaters, 70 millimeter. So that's why they double shot. They would actually have two cameras side by side.
What was projected at 30 frames?
The 70 millimeter prints were projected, 5 per 70.
30. And that's why I think Sean's comments about this being cultural as much as technological is 24 was arrived at because films were shot at 18 or 16 frames. They needed to move it faster to get the optical track to have adequate sound quality. And that's how we arrived at 24, and then we adjusted to it. And remember, if films are both photographed and projected at higher frame rates, it changes everything, even production design, details things. And so it's an open question. It can be just said to look too real and too whatever, but our brains aren't magically 24 frame brains. So I think it's an open question that we both artistically and technically have to figure out, because there are definitely some problems it could help us solve on the giant screen in particular. So,
well, James Cameron is doing.
We did some tests on 30 frames a second, both in shooting and projecting in IMAX, and we couldn't tell the difference. Nobody could.
Between 24 and 30?
Yeah, we all thought it'd be a financially plausible improvement to IMAX, but We just couldn't see any benefit to it. You apparently don't see the benefit until you're up around 48 frames. I don't know if that's true. Hollywood did tests in the 30s of the same thing and arrived at 24 frames a second as a kind of economic, a reasonable economic
James
compromise.
Cameron is doing the Avatar sequence or the series. I believe he's trying higher frame rates, and that'll be interesting when those films come out. And they're supposed to be aquatic, so it could be really pretty. Looking at images at 60 frames a second or whatever he's chosen.
And I assume the digital projectors today, you could just go from a 24 frame film, click to a 30 frame.
And it could change during the film. Some scenes could be at 1 frame rate and other scenes appropriate. I mean, why not adapt the frame rate to what you're trying to achieve at a given moment in the film? So there's just a lot.
It's like brainstorm.
Yes, exactly. But the other thing, Greg, I wanted to mention or open the discussion to is this idea that for a long time, the price of entry into giant screen filmmaking had a lot to do with access or renting or owning, as Greg does, giant screen 1570 millimeter cameras. And now one could argue that although there's nothing that magically makes a 4K or 6K or 8K video appropriate for IMAX, there's a lot of material being captured out there in the world that can, by some measure, maybe even if it's a step backwards, be pushed onto the giant screen. And it strikes me that that doesn't mean that every kid out there shooting with his iPhone is an IMAX filmmaker, but it does mean that I think our films have to reflect the new technology and become as adept and intimate as they sometimes need to be. I mean, Greg and I did a sequence about sky surfing where we did 30 jumps with the camera held on a cameraman's chest that held 90 seconds of film. Well, if we were shooting that today, we'd probably be using different tools. So again, how do you guys feel about the integration of old and new as we move forward?
Oh, no, absolutely.
I think we're all doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I think the gold standard, for the landscapes and aerials, we haven't seen a digital camera that can beat a 1570 camera for that. But sadly, the medium has changed as well, because now all the film projectors are being replaced by essentially a 4K deliverable to laser illumination, and the same is going to be true, from what I understand, when the IMAX Dome system comes out. So all you can rely upon to get a sharp image is oversampling. So you can shoot at 8K, which really isn't 8K. That's another discussion, but. You can shoot at the highest resolution you can get and downsample it to the 4K, which is good, but you're still, the 4K precludes getting the kind of resolution you saw with film, sadly.
Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at an example of an old-fashioned film on IMAX, and that I think is pretty darn impressive, and it makes you think about how things work in IMAX. Here we go. Here's a trailer you'll recognize.
In the ice fall, we use ladders a lot, which can take a little getting used to.
I like to get my falling done early, because later on, I don't like to fall again. When you look down, you wonder how deep is that crevasse. Well, I don't want to find out. The Sherpa said that if you fall in the crevasse, you will fall all the way to America.
Would you do that any differently today with digital smaller cameras? And how did you do the walking shot? Do you have that little camera, Greg? Didn't you build a little teeny camera?
I know I don't have it with me right now, but Frankly, no, I wouldn't do it much differently. The reason is that you can see that even for images that are somewhat intimate, we're providing a lot of peripheral vision, and you get a sense of being there in the ice fall. The shots are held on the screen longer, so you can get that sensation. The lighting is so beautiful that, you know, we waited a long time to get that sequence completed. And in fact, we couldn't do that looking down shot with the big IMAX camera there safely. And so I chose to do it back here. And we went to Mount Hood, found a crevasse that looked the same, took the ladder, duplicated the ladder with the tie off ropes and all that exactly, and the same boots and everything else. And then ran a rig over the top of the climber as he went across, so that the camera would be suspended on a wheel, a dolly type of track, so that it was perfectly smooth. So your distance and your wobbling as you walked over that ladder wasn't nauseating. And it, you know, took several days to do that one shot, but it matches in perfectly, gives you that sensation. You see that on a giant screen and you're awestruck. You're there. You're the climber looking down at her feet, and you remember that scene. And so it was a nice choice, actually, because there was that one wide shot that it started the sequence there in the icefall where you can just barely see the climbers. But in IMAX or in OmniMax, those guys are in almost a medium shot. And so it really shows the power of IMAX to take you there and give you that sensation that you know what it's like to be on Everest in the icefall.
So in a conversation I had just doing testing with Steven yesterday, he was talking about the new Sony Venice, and that's why I went to this shot that Ban
Yeah.
had up. And is this going to revolutionize the whole business here to a large degree, or, you know, and the fact that everything, you know, Mark hit on a really important point, which has happened in regular filmmaking, is that the cost of entry used to be what? The minimum would be $3, $4, $5 million to make an IMAX, to make a cheap IMAX film. Now, if you can go out and rent a Sony Venice, you know, for not that much dough, and you've got the best lenses, can you shoot a film, you know, an IMAX film?
Absolutely.
I just got finished shooting about a month, 3 weeks in the deep ocean, and also on latest train film. What I liked about the Venice is the colors are better than the digital cameras I've seen in the past. They're very close to film colors, and the resolution of 6K is pretty good. I think one thing I should mention, we were talking about frame rates, it only runs at 24 frames a second. So there's obviously a challenge to collect film size data with digital cameras. It's taken 20 years to get to 6K and a 4:3 or a 3:2 aspect ratio, I guess. But it is a lot better than the previous digital cameras, which I think bodes well for IMAX, because there isn't as much money around as there used to be for making films. And I think that everything else being equal, it will enable us to focus more on storytelling than just wrangling these huge, expensive cameras. And IMAX was a very, very difficult medium to use well. It's a lot more fun to use digital cameras where, you know, you can leave them running to get better performances out of people. You can mount them all over the place, and you can experiment a lot more. You can, you know, we mounted cameras all over the ship as we were launching submarines, and even odd, kind of interesting shots you don't know how they're going to play out until they played out. And you can't do that in IMAX. You've got to be damn sure that every shot is going to work and going to fit into the film. So
it's a little ironic, isn't it?
Brutally challenging.
Hollywood's interest. I was just saying it's a little ironic. Hollywood's interest, James Cameron and others in these 1570 cameras. I salute them. And here we've been wrangling them for decades, trying to figure out ways to make them lighter on their feet. And I think you saw even. I'm sure there were some shots that Chris Nolan wasn't able to get on Dunkirk because he had the big camera. And I'm not arguing against them. I'm just saying it's interesting to see, as we look for solutions to particular problems that maybe digital would solve, and some theatrical filmmakers are looking at these 1570 cameras.
Well,
wow.
Yeah, those big film cameras need good light, as Greg said. Sometimes we'd wait a week just to do a shot. A week of rain with no cover set. And you can't do that in drama. I saw that even on some of my early films that I worked on in Hollywood, like Days of Heaven. You know, if you want a magic or a movie, you waste the whole day doing nothing. That's hard in Hollywood, but with a 1570 camera and 100 people standing around, it's just not going to work. I think you just make too many compromises by using IMAX.
Not to change the subject, but what did you do on Days of Heaven?
Oh, I was just I did production stills for a while, and I drove people around, and
I
worked on the set. I built the house, helped to build the house.
One of the best movies ever made of all time.
Oh, well,
my opinion.
That was pretty. Still loved IMAX.
What'd you say, Greg?
Well, Terrence Malick did that film, and he loves IMAX.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was very friendly with Nestor Almendros and learned a great deal from him. He was a very, very friendly guy. He used to invite us to the screenings every day, and the producer would kick us out every day.
Did they sit around all day and wait? Didn't they? Is it about magic hour?
No, they actually shot all day, but they didn't use it. So there were marvelous sort of performances under the wagons and the shadows and stuff. They just threw it out because the director wanted it all beautiful light. So it's just compromises you make, and drama is already very demanding and expensive, and so add another layer on, and it's virtually undoable. I mean, the stock costs are 10 times, and there's no blimping of the camera. I mean, the blimp it's very difficult.
Yes, well, sometimes absolutely. For example, when it's filming on the aircraft carrier for your most recent film with Sean developed a compact digital stereo system because the other stereo systems wouldn't fit through the passageways, and you literally couldn't physically walk down the hall. So, and luckily, these digital formats work at their best when they're in a confined environment, when it isn't infinity that you're seeing deep. And but it made it possible to get shots in 3D on board that simply we couldn't have gotten. A Solito wouldn't have fit through the
good transition. Let's take a look.
Well, that's a 1570 shot.
You bet
it is an engineering marvel, capable of patrolling the far reaches of the world's oceans for years without refueling. With a highly trained and ready crew of 5,092 aircraft aboard, providing unprecedented air power and intelligence, the modern U.S. nuclear carrier is the dominant flagship of our time. But providing the peace and security of the world's vast oceans has become far more complex and dangerous, requiring the combined strength and cutting-edge technology of the world's allies.
Well, I'll come back because we're getting close to time. And what have we not covered here? Do you think IMAX is something that young filmmakers should think about getting into, or is?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's I mean, all filmmaking is I think headed towards a greater degree of immersion, and there's a lot of things that are going on now that are pretty exciting. I think it's going to be a while before they really become a killer app. Like like virtual reality is something that gaming will probably be a killer app for VR, but in 20 years it'll probably be commonplace. Also, the tools, the democratization of the tools makes it easier for younger people to get into these formats. So in the case, the absolute bottom line guerrilla filmmaking case for an IMAX movie is, you know, if you take a GH5, which is a $2,000 DSLR, and set it at its higher resolution, which is actually like 5.5K. It is so small and lightweight, and it has automatic stabilization. You can shoot intimate scenes with people, and they will blow up, you know, to the giant screen format extremely well. It's not that you would shoot your whole movie that way, but that could give you, you know, key scenes or capture events that you could just never have done with any kind of film technology. And then, of course, we still have all the other tools. We still have 1570 cameras. We have the 8K cameras and 6K cameras and 3D rigs and fisheye lenses, and, you know, more and more tools coming every day. So it's a great time for filmmakers. Digital has really been a profound revolution for filmmaking.
It's the Wild West of innovation now.
Greg, are you the film guy here, more filmic than digital, still sort of waiting for it to get better, or are you on the train, of the digital train?
Well, I still believe in kind of the power of IMAX to take you there. And I still feel that, and all of our polling that we do with customers shows that the reason that they come to an IMAX theater is to have that feeling of being there. It's so different than watching a feature film or a television show or something on your iPhone. And that difference is worth the admission price. If you're not delivering that, as you know, some of the 2K films have shown us over the past, theaters will lose their customer base. And unfortunately, that's happened in a few instances, and theaters have had to close. But those theaters, you know, like St. Paul and others that have stuck to the 1570 format and done a good job of promoting these exceptional experiences that are so immersive, have succeeded even better today than before. And so what I love to do is experiment with these new tools and figure out ways to use them. Whether it's like Mark said, taking them into places that you haven't been able to take the big IMAX camera, or as we're doing with our new Ireland film that we're beginning on in next week, trying to make every shot a fluid movement shot, so that one shot flows into the next shot, flows into the next shot. And so you end up with these smaller cameras being able to kind of give the audience a sense of being there, but almost without any blinking or cutting. And I'm hopeful that, and I've done experiments, that magic of actually these long takes that go from one shot to the next shot to the next shot, but invisibly, will be fun to watch and engaging in a new way. Ireland is a great set for that. And you know, if you can think doing a space cam 1570 shot, and the shot coming down near the ground, and then that cutting to a drone shot with an 8K camera on the drone, digital, and then that going into a more fluid shot on a dolly, with people, you know, choreographed motion and people doing action. It's one of those things that I'm hopeful that the film will feel different than what we have all done before. And that's because of the digital cameras. That's because of these small drones. That's because you know, technology is lifting us up.
Well, sign me up to be the first one to watch that film, because I just made my first trip to Ireland last October. I had a fabulous time. I think it's a wonderful place. I'd like to go back. Is there any note we haven't touched on in terms of IMAX that anybody wants to say before we wrap this up?
Well, it is a truly unique environment.
I think I'd like to say that it's the 50th anniversary of IMAX as a system. And the brave Canadian filmmakers that began this system, and Stephen's father was one of those, really were courageous and visionary. And what they brought for all of us, the five of us here, is a life of new kinds of experiences with every film that we've made. And so, gosh, thank you guys. They did a wonderful job.
Well,
these formats have taken us to some amazing places.
I want to say thanks also for all of you for coming on here and the time that you have dedicated to this show, and for all your IMAX films. And the next show will be the 23rd here with Charlie Parsons, Vice President of Development at National Geographic. Please tell all your friends, because we want those eyeballs. And
thank you very much, Chuck, for having us.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
I
Chuck.
appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care, guys. Hold on while I bail out of here. Hold on.
Chuck, are you there? Did you want to do any more?